Death. That was the odor that occupied the room. The pungent smell of vomit and sweat was evident, but the stench of rotting, dead flesh was predominant. David looked fearfully at his mother, lying helpless on the bed. He knew she was sick, but the sight of her disease-eaten flesh made him feel an array of emotions, with fear being the front runner. He was scared for his mother. He did not want her to die, but the fear was also for his own well-being. The imminent fear that it could be contagious made him keep his distance. His father sat holding his mother's hand. The bits of the hand that remained, that is. The disease had stripped his caregiver of most of the muscle and flesh she had once used to nurture and care for him. All the money and power his father had was of no use against a disease such as this. World-renowned doctors and specialists had been called as soon as his mother had exhibited signs of the sickness, all to no avail. Disease does not discriminate. Janice was suffering just as the poor do, dying with no means of recovery. Necrotizing fasciitis was a name for what ailed his mother. He had heard it on the news a while before he saw it plague his mother, the flesh-eating disease. Or if the stories he had heard around school before it closed were anything to go on, the zombie disease was a more applicable diagnosis. The fever and nausea were the first symptoms. Janice was unable to take her son to school, lying weak in her bed with her temperature climbing steadily. David's father, Jonathan, put it down to a bug of sorts and simply picked up the slack by doing the duties around the house his wife was unable to do. By the second week of the sickness, Janice was completely unable to move, with her fingers and toes taking on a darkish hue. David had continued to go to school and had heard of many kids talking about other people suffering from a similar-sounding sickness, but in all the stories he had heard, none of them ended well. Fearing for his mother's health, David repeated these stories to his father, only to be met with reassurance and comfort. That reassurance and comfort proved to be meaningless as he now sat looking at the disease-riddled body of his mother. Flesh, eaten beyond comprehension. Holes gaping in places unimaginable. Jonathan had tried his best by all means as soon as he saw his wife's condition deteriorate. A number of doctors were called for consultation. They all came to the same prognosis: necrotizing fasciitis, the flesh-eating disease. According to the doctors looking after her, she was one of the first to be stricken by the disease. And just as the others had, her condition had progressed. Their only suggestion was to move her to the hospital wing they had designated to those afflicted with the disease. Before moving her, Jonathan thought to take David to see the hospital, where they would care for his mother. They discussed the matter with her and decided to make the trip the next day.
"You've been avoiding me, baby,"
Janice said once alone with David. I'm just scared, Mom. I don't want you to die," came David's reply. Laughing, Janice told David,
"That's not something you need to worry about, my son. What you need to worry about is how comfy my room there is going to be."
Joining in with his mother's laughter, David finally dropped his inhibitions and sat close to his mother, resting his head on her bed. She stroked his head as he fell asleep. He had not slept long at the bedside of his mother, but his dreams were those of zombies, and those they hunted. His father woke him to go to bed, and the disturbance of the dreams was a thorough welcome by David. Walking half asleep towards the door, he could but help glance back at his mother. He could feel the tears well up as the woman lying in the bed closely resembled those creatures that haunted his dream. The drive to the hospital the next day was excruciating. The silence seemed to drill deep into David's core as he sat next to his father. He could feel the sadness and pain emanating from the man he had always viewed as an absolute pillar of strength and wisdom. When the journey had finally ended, and they sat in the car park of the hospital, David suddenly burst into tears. The stark reality of the possibility of losing his mother had hit him like a freightliner, moving at remarkable speeds. His father hesitated for a second, unsure of what the appropriate response would be, given that he too felt so unable to do anything. He wanted to cry too. He held his son. The two embraced tightly and said nothing. No words could have helped either feel better. The dark clouds drifting in the sky outside them closely resembled the way both of them felt inside, cold and lost. The bright lights in the hospital corridor beat down on them. They winced as they walked in, waiting for their eyes to adjust.
Good morning. We're here to view and book a room in the CDC wing, please.
Jonathan asked.
We're sorry to inform you there's been an incident in the CDC room, sir. We're not accepting any new patients at the moment.
What? That's preposterous! What kind of incident?
Jonathan shouted at the nurse. Before she could answer, the doors to the CDC wing burst open, and what looked like the remnants of a man ran through the doors, leaving footprints of blood behind him. He lunged at a woman seated on the chairs outside the Center for Disease Control, and people were too shocked to respond, pinning her down. Jonathan and David could see the sick man biting and clawing at the woman's face. Blood and flesh flew everywhere. He had more holes in him than flesh. Bits of bone could be seen through the loose hanging hospital gown that covered the eaten man. The disease had all but devoured his body, and it was a miracle he was able to move.
Does that answer your question, sir?
The nurse screeched as she made a beeline for the exit. Dragging David, Jonathan followed the panicked crowds through the door and towards the car park. The only people left in the hospital were the zombie-looking individual and his victim. Well, what was left of her, after he had eaten his fill and pulled all of her intestines out through the hole he had chewed in her stomach. Rushing to get in the car, David and Jonathan said nothing as they ran and pushed through the crowds to get where they were going. Locking themselves in the car, they merely sat where they were, not moving, not saying anything, bursting into tears once again. David was the one to finally break the silence.
We have to get home to Mom, Tad.
As they pulled into the driveway, Jonathan had already begun giving David instructions.
As soon as we get in, you need to go up to your room and pack a bag. We are going straight to the airport and get on a plane to India. Your Uncle Kieran mentioned something about doctors working on stuff like this there. We'll take your mother. This'll all be sorted out. Come straight to the room when you've packed.
Almost as soon as the car was stationary, David leapt out of the car and ran up the driveway and into the house. Jonathan was close behind. As Jonathan made his way into his bedroom, he could hear his son cursing and banging the cupboard doors. He, too, would pack a bag for him and his wife, and they would leave to a safer place. Having finished packing some clothes into a bag, David closed it and ran out of his room. The tears had begun to dry, and a smile crept over his face at the thought of the three of them flying to India to make Mum better. Who knows? Maybe Uncle Kieran would be waiting at the airport for them. Bursting through the door of his parents' room, the smile that had recently formed once again dissolved into tears. There would be no trip to the airport, let alone India. Straddling her husband on their bed, David could see his mother. Her head was buried into her husband's chest as she feasted. Jonathan's hand dangled off the bed, drenched in his own blood. The only thing David could hear over his loud breaths was the grotesque sound of his mother chewing and slurping the bits of flesh and blood that she was stuffing her face with. Standing there frozen, David saw his mother turn to face him. What now looked him in the eye was not his mother. Blood dripping from its chin, dead eyes staring. It stood up, leaving Jonathan lying on the bed with holes chewed in his body. David felt his legs give out.
Mom?
He said weakly, tears streaming down his cheek, hoping something inside of the creature would hear and recognize her son, and perhaps grant him mercy. The ground seemed to shake as it took a step towards him.